We naturally picture the universe as a container, a massive, expanding physical box that holds every star, planet, and galaxy within its walls. It is an intuitive shape to imagine, and it comes with a comforting assumption that given enough rocket fuel and enough time, we could point a ship in any direction and eventually arrive at any destination inside that box. The observer-dependent theory maps existence as precise coordinates within a singular mathematical structure. Realities exist as distinct points, or nodes, suspended in a unified field. This is the configuration space. It contains every variation of the physical laws and every alternate timeline as a specific, interconnected address on the grid. In this geometry, the physical void we perceive is a local effect of our current coordinates. The true gap between 2 points is not a distance in meters, but the mathematical difficulty of shifting our collective observation to a new set of values. We map these boundaries using a topographical landscape. Deep valleys represent stable modes of existence, separated by high mountain passes, mathematical saddle points, known as reality barriers. These passes possess 3 distinct limitations: spatial distance, temporal horizons, and dimensional height. Breaking through these structures requires more than raw velocity. Physical propulsion alone cannot cross different dimensions of reality. However, the height of these barriers is variable. As a civilization advances technologically, the mathematical resistance reduces, the saddle point flattens, making the transition possible. Reality, then, is a highly responsive landscape. It molds itself precisely to the evolutionary capacity of the minds observing it. Humanity has already begun manipulating these barriers. We passed threshold 1 when early roads and ships connected isolated tribes, merging localized groups into a shared physical reality. We then reached threshold 2. By crossing oceans through the air, we began to negate the spatial barrier of the entire planet. Soon after, telegraphs and radio started linking minds across vast distances, removing the time delay from human interaction. This connectivity matured into a global network that forces millions of observers to process the same digital data simultaneously. By synchronizing human observation to this degree, the internet drives our collective coherence toward a maximum. This lockstep actualization flattens the barrier between previously divergent realities, merging the planet into a single, rigid version of the world. Expanding our configuration space further requires raw force. Reaching threshold 3 takes immense physical trauma to puncture a gravity well and leave the surface behind. Establishing a permanent foothold above the homeworld expands the observer's horizon into the orbital plane. That outward push eventually hits threshold 4, the interstellar barrier. Here, the speed of light enforces a limit on how fast information can propagate across the void. This creates the inertia coherence paradox. To function across light years, a civilization must increase its internal synchronization. But to move between stars, it must also lower its inertia, its rigid attachment to its current configuration of reality. Survival at this level requires a species to maintain perfect cohesion while remaining willing to discard its current definition of what is physically possible. Civilizations failing to balance these opposing forces suffer mathematical fragmentation. They break apart into isolated branches, trapped forever behind the interstellar wall. Moving past that wall brings us to threshold 5. Here, traveling from point A to point B through physical space becomes mathematically inefficient. Bypassing this barrier requires teleportation. Matter must de-actualize into a field of potential and reform at a completely separate address on the configuration grid. At threshold 6, we encounter the multiversal barrier. This boundary separates regimes of physics where the underlying constants and state spaces no longer align with our own. Technology at this stage transitions from physical propulsion to the design of the observation operator, the mathematical framework that dictates how a collective consciousness actualizes reality. A civilization at this threshold stops residing within a predetermined universe. It becomes an active architect of the multiverse. Gaining multiversal control causes the accessible configurations to scale toward the total cardinality of the multiverse. This access brings a proportional burden of responsibility. The civilization must deliberately navigate a landscape of nearly infinite divergent outcomes. This geometry plots the theorem of barrier infinity. The golden ratio spiral charts the barriers a civilization must cross, spacing them further apart along the curve as the level of complexity increases. The mathematical proof of this sequence confirms there is no upper bound. Civilizational development is an infinite, unending climb. This leaves one theoretical question. What happens to a civilization that scales this infinite staircase and attempts to observe every coordinate of the multiverse simultaneously? They encounter the completion paradox. Mathematical formulas show that attempting to observe every possible state simultaneously dilutes the probability of any single reality down to zero. Achieving absolute observer status forces physical existence to unravel. Without a specific boundary to observe, the multiverse returns to a state of pure potential. Existence is not a linear progression. It operates as a cyclical strange loop of potential, observation, and material reality. Navigating this loop requires synchronized flexibility. A civilization survives by releasing its grip on what it believes is real, so that it may step across the barrier into what is possible.